Gaudete, gaudete, Christus es natus, ex Maria Virgine gaudete.
Welcome to the Rediscovery channel. This is the channel where I, Ivor Kovac, and my good friend Stilgar, and sometimes Great Pharaoh, take turns coming up with topics from history that the other person doesn't know about and often hasn't heard about. However, today is actually part 2. It's the continuation of my last entry about Neanderthal man. And last time we talked about the physical attributes of Neanderthals as well as their genetics. And now what I want to do is get into their culture, and then I'm going to discuss what I think happened to them and maybe touch on some other theories. But of course, I think that mine is the correct one, and suggest an identity of an identity for the Neanderthal people that was kept in the records of our ancestors. So let's get started then. So I'm going to talk about the Neanderthal culture and what we can tell of it based on the studies. So one thing is, it looks like the Neanderthals were afflicted with autism. And there's some information that supports this. So basically, there's two studies that I'm going to bring up. There's more than 2 studies, but I'm just going to bring up 2. So one is a paper that was published in 2024 called Enrichment of a Subset of Neanderthal Polymorphisms in Autistic Probands and Siblings. This article is by Rini Pauli, Layla Johnson, F. Alex Feltus, and Emily L. Casanova. And what these guys did is they conducted multiple studies on people that are alive today, tracking the presence of Neanderthal DNA in them. And they didn't just look at one race, they looked at multiple races, because like we said in the last one, everyone has some Neanderthal DNA in them, typically about 2%, except for sub-Saharan Africans who usually have none at all. Now with African Americans, it will be different because they are about 20% or so European on average. They're an admixed group for the most part. But in general, for sub-Saharan Africans, they won't have any Neanderthal DNA. But I want to quote from this article what they said. So I'm not going to read the whole thing, but additional research involving non-clinical populations has identified strong links between certain brain and skull morphologies and enrichment of Neanderthal DNA. Specifically, enrichment is associated with reduced globularity in the skull shape of modern populations, a finding mildly reminiscent of the elongated skull morphology characteristics of Neanderthal and other archaic crania. Enrichment of Neanderthal DNA is also associated with enhanced neural connectivity within visual processing systems, particularly between the interparietal sulcus and the occipital cortex and fusiform gyrus, and decreased connectivity within the default mode social network. Importantly, many of these same connectivity patterns are recapitulated in autism, which is a major impetus for the current work. For instance, underconnectivity within the default mode network is consistently reported in autism. Meanwhile, increased connectivity within visual processing networks is also a commonly reported feature. So, in case anybody didn't understand that, as simply as I can put it, what they said is the more Neanderthal DNA a person has, the greater the risk of autism. There's a correlation with the presence of Neanderthal DNA and a risk of autism.
So if you have autism, you have a higher level of connections in your visual cortex.
Yes,
and a lower level in what was the other one? Fewer connections in the
default mode, which I'm not sure what part of the brain that corresponds to. Maybe the frontal lobe.
Like the daily life, like you.
Yeah, so
you don't understand daily life, but you're really good at drawing. maybe.
A lot of people will say that autists are good at recognizing patterns. I want to talk about autism a little bit and what that
Okay.
means. I'm sure
Yeah.
we've got autists that listen to us, at least some, but I'll explain it exactly in a little bit. I want to go over one more piece of evidence here that indicates Neanderthals had autism. So there's another study conducted by Alison Motri, who is a geneticist that works at the University of California in San Diego. And what he has done is he's actually created clusters of brain cells in a lab. He grows them in petri dishes and sustains them with nutrient fluid. And he used genetic material from both modern humans and Neanderthals to grow little, like, mini brains inside these dishes. And I guess the human brains were grown. I mean, Neanderthals were also humans, but I'm just that's the way they worded it in the article. So I should say modern human brains were grown for control purposes, and of course the Neanderthal brains are compared with that. And what he found is that the Neanderthal mini brains formed less synaptic connections and structurally resembled the brain cells of children with autism. So, what is autism and how does it work? Basically, people with autism, they have a harder time with social activities and nonverbal types of things. So a lot of people that have autism will have difficulty in understanding things like sarcasm and innuendo, anything other than clear, direct communication, really. Autists will get hyper focused on some things and be completely inept with other things. They're better at specialized tasks, especially if it's something to interest them. They're not going to be that good at, if you need somebody that can do a little bit of everything, that's definitely not going to be somebody with autism. So, like, if anybody's been listening for a while to our channel, they probably figured out that I'm a little bit touched with autism, which is true. And basically, the way it is if you have autism, uh, something will happen where you think you're just going about your normal life, and somebody's like, I can't believe you just said that or did that. And you're like, what? And basically, you don't have the default reactions to social social incidences, and the reaction that you give naturally isn't the considered like the normal or default reaction, for example. And a lot of autists will engage in something called masking, where they don't give the expected responses to social situations. They don't pick up on subtext or nonverbal clues or any of this kind of stuff, and so they will observe normal people and then try to act accordingly, like kind of like the way an actor will play a part in a movie, like whatever actor, whatever movie, he can be a good guy in this movie, a bad guy in that movie, so on and so forth. Well, none of those guys is who the actor is. It's just a part he plays. So autists will usually engage in this masking behavior where they try to act normal, but it requires a conscious effort from them. So usually at the end of the day, a lot of autists will feel tired because they had to go through this extra effort to act normal during the day. And of course, today autists are usually perceived as weird and stuff like that, and people don't always. People will think that there's bad intentions or malice sometimes because they get a response which doesn't seem like the normal response. And they'll think that there's bad intent behind it, but really it's just like a matter of, well, who decides what the normal response is, and how am I supposed to know that? And what a lot of autists, the way they'll describe it is that it's like everybody else was given a manual of instructions on how to behave and what to say and how to react and what's acceptable, except for me. So it's mainly a social disorder. Sometimes autists are very good at recognizing patterns, well, a lot of times. And anybody that wants to look up more on that, you can, obviously there's lots of material there if anybody's interested. But what would it mean if the whole culture is, well, let me say one more thing. In today's world, some of the behaviors that autists will engage in, there's something called stimming, where they'll be moving like their hands or some other part of their bodies. So autists, they have the stimming behavior, and when they usually don't just fit in with a group. They'll have not many friends. It's difficult to make friends even when they want to. And the friends that they do have, a lot of times don't even know each other. And they'll cross lines with regards to race and culture, have friends that are older, younger, because they just don't really like gel or vibe, or whatever you want to say, with any particular group. Like group identity is more difficult for an autistic person. So the thing is, imagine if you had a whole culture where everybody's autistic and that's what's normal. So these people are not going to use sarcasm. They're not going to use innuendo. They'll just state whatever they want to state. And if they don't want the kid or something to hear it, they'll probably whisper it instead of like trying to speak in code or whatever. Communication would be much more direct. And I imagine that when European man, the ancestors that of the people that are, what we mostly are today, still are, you and me, when our ancestors started coming into Europe and encountering these Neanderthals, not only would there be a language barrier, but there would also be a fundamental difference in the use of language and the style of communication, because you have one group that uses a lot of metaphor, that uses metaphor and sarcasm and innuendo, and another group that just default takes everything literally. Like it's a situation that can get heated very fast. Like a misunderstanding, miscommunication can lead to frustration. Frustration can lead to violence. Like you have somebody that makes a joke and says like, "Hey, you should go do this," and then the autist goes and does it, and he gets hurt, and the normal person is like, "Hey, I was just joking, man. That was sarcasm. Can't you tell?" Well, no. Now, those autists who have higher IQ, they can pick up and compensate. They have to, learn to recognize. Basically, you have to create a set of if-then statements in order to navigate life. Like, if this happens, I do this. If this happens, it means that. So, like for me, I didn't even know that sarcasm existed as a real thing until I was 13 years old. And when I started getting exposed to it like heavily, I just took it as the person saying whatever they want to say. And then people started saying like, "Hey man, can't you tell he's not serious? That he means the opposite of what he's saying?" And I learned a pattern like, okay, when people pitch their voice a certain way, uh, then they mean the opposite of what the words are actually saying. So like if I say, "Hey, Stilgar, that's a good job," then that's sarcasm, right? But then if I say, "Hey, Stilgar, that's a good job," that's the normal way of just saying what you mean. But an autist, by default, will take both of them as normal. So, yeah, and it can escalate to violence, and misunderstanding. So now, actually, there's been no evidence of widespread conflict or battle between Europeans and any other current race of humans and Neanderthal man. Most of the articles I read, they said they didn't find any evidence of violent conflict, but I did come across one incident where they think that a Neanderthal was slain by another race of human, like a more, today what we would say modern human, based on the weapon. Like this guy was shot through the chest with an arrow or something like that. So yeah, I think we can go on from here, but that's one thing that everybody should understand. So there would be like some serious issues that could get heated, when these people come together. If these guys really were autistic, and it looks like they were from the genetic evidence, and also from the fact that when they clone the brain cells of these people, it turns out like that. Of course, the DNA from, not the, they haven't sequenced the DNA from all Neanderthals, right? And
I think
I
it's
don't.
also a bit hard to say that just because of their brains may have looked a certain way that they had autism. I don't know. It's a bit of there because there's no recorded history of them being
I'm gonna
autistic.
get to the yeah, well, kind of, sort of, maybe.
Okay.
I mean, we'll come back to that, but based on the analysis of their DNA and the cultures that they've grown from their brains, it's looking like this is the case, and there's ongoing studies on this. So now, of course, they haven't analyzed every single Neanderthal that's ever lived, and I don't know how many bones that they've found, and of those, I don't know how many bones they've sequenced the DNA from, but based on what's been found so far, it looks like this is the case, that they did have autism. And some of the articles I read, they said that even though the Neanderthal brain is larger than a modern European brain, more of the brain was devoted to visual processing than thought process. I mean, compared with us, more of their brain was devoted to visual processing. So, so yeah, that could also be a factor in their extinction if they were like this. And I don't know how well, I haven't seen any attempts today of autists trying to form their own communities. Because, like, even if I'm an autist, it doesn't mean I'm going to be friends with all other autists. Because we do tend to get hyper focused on things, and we also tend to dwell on things longer than most people have patience for us to dwell on them. But that doesn't mean that we're all going to be friends. Like, I could be very interested in space exploration and just want to talk about that all the time. And, Billy Bob could also have autism, but maybe his focus is on sports. Well, I don't have enough common ground with Billy Bob to have a conversation, even though we have some of the same mental tendencies, right? Like, what am I going to do? I don't care about sports. So, yeah, I mean, it could have been difficult. There could have been some community forming issues, and also another thing about autism is that you aren't good with transitions. It's hard to transition from one activity to the other, and also don't like changes. You have a routine, and when something disrupts your routine, it's really annoying. And if you're on like the lower IQ end, you have autism and you have lower IQ, then um, you're really not going to react well to these things, and it may not even be possible for you to pretend to be normal or get along with normal people because you're more limited and you can't compensate, and you don't have the natural instincts and you don't have the intellect to compensate for them. I'm not saying that Neanderthals were retarded or anything like that. It looks like they were actually smarter. But yeah, let's keep going. So caloric intake, food requirement. It looks like Neanderthals, it's been estimated that they required 4,480 calories per day on average to survive. Whereas for modern humans of all races, the recommended daily caloric intake is 2,500 calories a day. So these guys are eating a lot more food, and it looks like it's mostly red meat. Um, Possibly up to 70% of their diet consisted of meat. Although there is a theory that they may have eaten a lot of carbs as well, but that's just a theory that's on the side. And it's a fact that they used to hunt large animals. So their diet involved bison, wild cattle, reindeer, deer, ibex, wild boar, woolly mammoths, and woolly rhinoceros. And the woolly mammoth and woolly rhinoceros were a big part of their diet. And I suspect that the Neanderthal man is a big factor in them going extinct. Um, and it looks like when it comes to their preferred mode of hunting, they preferred CQC as the means of killing, which is close quarters combat. And most of the Neanderthal skeletons that have been found show evidence of severe trauma and broken bones, which have healed. Very seldom do you find an adult Neanderthal skeleton that doesn't have a break somewhere. It's also possible they ate plants, and as some of the tools that have been found have plant residue on them, but they're unsure if the plants were used for food or medicinal purposes or both. The plants that they might have eaten could have included legumes, seeds, fruits, and grasses. I doubt they ate grasses, unless it's like wheat or something like that. You know, wheat is technically a grass, I think so. So Neanderthals made use of stone tools, including knives, axes, spears, and implements for sharpening them. They made a lot of domestic tools, including scrapers for tanning hides, owls for punching holes in the animal skins in order to sew them up and make clothes, burins for cutting into wood and bone, and items for killing and preparing animals for food. They knew how to make fire. They also made a form of pitch or tar that was used with birch bark. And it looks like they made use of either makeup, war paint, or both. So they created and made use of red and black pigments, which they did paint on themselves. Actually, some of the red ochre has been found on skeletons of Neanderthals, which might have been because they put it on the body of deceased. There's one of the books that I read, the guys speculated that they might have smeared the bodies with red ochre in order to give them the appearance of being still alive before they put them into the grave. So they created and wore jewelry. They did bury their dead. And sometimes they, like I said, they painted the bodies of the dead sometimes, smeared shells with ochre and moved them around. So it's possible that these shells were used as a form of currency or medium of exchange, and they might have been smeared with the black pigment in order to designate that they were a medium of exchange. I think there were some Native American cultures which actually used shells as a form of currency. They found a musical instrument in one of the Neanderthal sites in Slovenia. The site's called Divji Babe or Bobby. I don't have any idea how to say that. But it was a flute-like instrument with holes in it. They made use of feathers, shells, and bones, which were modified and appeared to be worn. Looks like some of these things were strung onto necklaces. They had holes punched through these shells and bones. I've also seen some indication that they did use precious gemstones and things for adornment. And then they created cave paintings, which is something that they used to think that Neanderthals were incapable of. And in addition to cave paintings, there are these scratching marks inside the caves, which, you know, there's some speculation, like, what are these marks? Because it's not artwork. So it could have even been like a written language. Somebody's going to call me stupid for saying that, but it's possible. Or it may have been a means of keeping track of time or counting. It could have just been like a math kind of thing. But I would just say, you know, for a long time, there was some debate over whether or not literacy should be maintained as a, maybe it wasn't a long time, but for a while there was a debate over whether or not literacy should be maintained as a hallmark of civilization because of the Inca people of Peru, who had all the other hallmarks of civilization but no discernible written language. And they were thinking about, well, maybe literacy, written text is not necessary for civilization because we don't find any evidence of it with these people. But actually, the Incas, they did have a system of writing, but it was a three-dimensional system. They made these things called quipus, which you had strings and knots tied along the strings at different distances and frequencies, and that was actually their system of writing. That was their words. So they used a three-dimensional text, if you get what I mean. So it turns out that, yes, writing is necessary for civilization. Maybe you don't recognize the type of writing they have, but you really need it. Maybe it wasn't writing at all. I don't know, but it could be. I mean, cuneiform just looks like a bunch of scratch, kind of. It's just a bunch of lines. So, alrighty then. Let's see what else we want to. Also, there's some tools that have these lines cut into them, and I'll put some pictures of those in the slideshow when this is rendered. Okay, so here, let's deal with some of the establishment official views of like what the so-called scientific establishment people say happened to the Neanderthals, what their theories are, and then we'll come to some truth. But basically, the official establishment people, they don't know what happened to the Neanderthals. Some theories that have been suggested, some factors that have been suggested in their disappearance include competition with normal humans, modern humans, or what we call modern humans today, and climate change, disease, maybe a combination of all these things. One thing that's been revealed is, I think through genetic studies, is that incest was a problem for some of their populations. It was a stressing factor on them. Incest and inbreeding. There's one article I read, more than one, where they think that what caused the demise of Neanderthals was that they were less sociable, that they had a harder time forming communities because they were less social. And when Europeans started moving up into Europe, our ancestors were coming in. They were better at rallying a posse together, and bringing a greater number of people, whereas the Neanderthals were more, I guess, individualistic. They didn't have as many friends to bring to the fight. This is speculation, but as somebody who's a little bit afflicted with autism, I know all about that firsthand, how that can go. Okay, so then one thing I've seen them saying a lot is they believe that Neanderthals coexisted with modern humans for about 3,000 to 5,000 something years without wiping each other out in all this time, and that there's no evidence of conflict during this time of coexistence, which I find to be completely irrational. Have you ever heard of any cultures existing side by side for 1,000 years without fighting?
No.
No, right? What about, I don't even know if it can be done for 100 years without fighting.
No, not even if they're like really close to each other, like genetically, but they just happen to have a different language or whatever.
Like Russians and Ukrainians are fighting right now. And
Russians and Poles, they've been fighting for, and if you look at them, like, I'm going to offend some people here, but I mean, they're not genetically, they're not that different. And their languages are both Slavic languages. So, yeah.
And also the Balkans and,
the Balkans are even more case in point. Yeah.
North Korea and South Korea, which are 100% genetically the same and have the same language, but they still are.
I mean, the Dutch and the Belgians, the Swedes and the Danes. Yeah.
So I find this aspect of their official narrative extremely unlikely, and I wouldn't consider it at all. Now, there's another guy that I came across. His name is Ludovic Slimak, and he proposes that Neanderthals were actually intellectually superior to modern Europeans, modern humans in general, but that they lost because they were physically outnumbered. And he also said that Neanderthals were excellent artisans and exhibited a higher level of creativity, but the Europeans focused on standardization instead of basically quantity over quality. So they mass-produced weapons, whereas a Neanderthal would spend a long time working on one, making it very nice. The the European man would just make a bunch that were kind of the same, and so that combined with being more of them, coming in waves and just outnumbering the Neanderthals, which, if that's the way it happened, there's a lesson to be learned in there about what can happen when you have endless immigration and open borders. But if anybody's interested in this guy's theory, which I find to be somewhat reasonable, his book is called The Naked Neanderthal, in case anyone's interested. The guy's name is Ludovic Slimak. I haven't read his book. I might read it, but I just read an article where he's talking about his book. So, or somebody's talking about it. Alrighty then. So now that I've said all this, I want to get to my the identity of Neanderthals and how they fit in with our records. And I want to share my logic of how I arrived at this conclusion. So what set me onto this idea was an article that I read from Haaretz, which is called Neanderthals Went Extinct in Iberia and Were Replaced by Other Neanderthals. And I'm not going to read the whole article. I'll just read a little bit of it. Basically, they're studying a Neanderthal site that's like right on the coast of Spain. So it's important. Remember, it's on the coast. The site was called Ehrenbalza 2. And it is actually a crafting site where Neanderthals made their tools. They called it, the archaeologists referred to it as an industrial site. So Ehrenbalza 2 says it's an open air site, an area clearly used by hominins that is not a cave or rock shelter. A huge number of tools were found there. In fact, the archaeologists suspect that Ehrenbalza 2 was a Neanderthal stoneworking factory, partly because it's close to a flint outcrop. And they believe that this area was one of the last outposts of the Neanderthal race, existing as an independent culture. So let me skip down here to the part that really set me off in this article. And I want to see if you come to the same conclusion I did. So, okay. No, their work cannot indicate which of the postulated causes, endogenous climate change, we nice folk moving into the neighborhood, were responsible. But if Neanderthals went extinct in Cantabria for 1,000+ years and then came back, we can suspect the howling vagaries of climate at the time were involved. In any case, by this time in their story, the Neanderthals were in decline. Their small groups under stress. Various reports show evidence of pathologies suggesting they were procreating through incest in the absence of more appealing options, that at least some were stricken by kuru after eating the brains of their own dead. So after reading this, my brain immediately leapt to something. But before I get to that, what do you think, Stilgar? Do you have any idea?
What is your question exactly?
Do you have any idea who the Neanderthals might be, where they fit in our records?
Oh, in some kind of tribe or people, you mean?
Yeah, anything.
I have no idea.
All right. Well, alrighty. So here then, what I want to do now is read a little bit from this book, because this is, after I read this article, this is exactly where my mind went. Okay, and this is actually from a book that you gave me, which I read a while ago. But so here, in those days, there were two dark elves who lived in a fortress by the sea. They did magic there and feats of wonderful alchemy. Like all dwarfs, they built things, wonderful, remarkable things, in their workshop and their forge. But there were things they had not yet made, and making those things obsessed them. They were brothers and were called Fjalar and Galar. When they heard that Kvasir was visiting a town nearby, they set out to meet him. Fjalar and Galar found Kvasir in the great hall, answering questions for the townsfolk, amazing all who listened. He told the people how to purify water and how to make cloth from nettles. He told one woman exactly who had stolen her knife and why. Once he was done talking and the townsfolk had fed him, the dwarves approached. We have a question to ask you what you have we have a question to ask you that you have never been asked before, they said, but it must be asked in private. Will you come with us? I will come, Kvasir said. They walked to the fortress. The seagulls screamed, and the brooding gray clouds were the same shade as the gray of the waves. The dwarves led Kvasir to their workshop deep within the walls of their fortress. What are those? Asked Kvasir. They are vats. They are called Son and Bodden. I see. And what is that over there? How can you be so wise when you do not know these things? It is a kettle. We call it Odravir, ecstasy giver. And I see over here you have buckets of honey you have gathered. It is uncapped and liquid. Indeed we do, said Fjalar. Galar looked scornful. If you were as wise as they say you are, you would know what our question to you would be before we asked it, and you would know what these things are for. Kvasir nodded in a resigned way. It seems to me, he said, that if you were both intelligent and evil, you might have decided to kill your visitor and let his blood flow into the vats of Son and Bodden. And then you would heat his blood gently in your kettle, Odravir, and after that you would blend uncapped honey with the mixture and let it ferment until it became mead, the finest mead, a drink that will intoxicate anyone who drinks it, but also give anyone who tastes it the gift of poetry and the gift of scholarship. We are intelligent, admitted Galar, and perhaps there are those who might think us evil. And with that he slashed Kvasir's throat, and they hung Kvasir by his feet above the vats until the last drop of his blood was drained. They warmed the blood and the honey in the kettle called Odravir, and did other things to it of their own devising. They put berries into it and stirred it with a stick. It bubbled, and then it ceased bubbling, and both of them sipped it and laughed, and each of the brothers found the verse and the poetry inside himself that he had never let out. So basically, Stilgar, is there something in our mythology? So the ways that they're reconstructing the Neanderthals today. If I ask you, what is it that's from our lore and our mythology that's short, that has that's got like a thick brows and strong arms, like shorter than humans but stronger, more buff and swole? What does that sound like to you?
Bulgarians?
Dwarfs,
I'm
man,
kidding.
dwarfs.
I'm kidding, by the way. That was a total joke. Nothing
Yeah,
against Bulgarians. I like them. Dwarfs, yeah. Dwarfs. You're
now,
talking about Fjalar and Galar, the Nordic those are evil dwarfs, but yeah, sure.
yeah.
Yeah.
So the way that they're rendering the Neanderthal man looks a lot like dwarves, like shorter, buff, swole, heavy brow ridge, and
If they're making tools all day in their caves.
right.
Yeah.
And do dwarves, do they have like a thin, sharp nose or like a small nose?
No, they got big wide noses.
Big, wide noses. Yeah. And what dwarves, they usually have light skin, right? And they live underground. So basically, I guess what you would call an intuitive leap after I read that article. And the book that I just read here from is called Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman, which is the book that you gave me a while ago. Also read to my son. He liked it. But yeah, that's where my brain went, and of course that doesn't necessarily prove a thing, but just for I've been an observer of culture for a long time and of history, and when you just constantly read and observe, like you read history, you read the news, you observe behavior, especially if you're always an outsider and you need to kind of observe people in order to, not keep them from bringing out the torches and pitchforks, like you start to recognize patterns. individuals are difficult to predict, but groups are not predictable to, or sorry, not difficult to predict. They're more like a system. They function like a system. You know, humans create systems, and systems have functions, and functions can be predicted. So another example, that's just where my brain leapt. I wanted to see if you would make that leap with me without me just dead giving it away. But remember when we did the video about Nestason, right? And he talks about how they brought out the Amun of Napata and had a procession, and then he talks to the idol. Like when I was reading about that, reading the Stela of Nestason where he's describing these events, my brain went to the Opet festival, the great festival that Cece put on in, I think it was 2020, 2021, whatever it was, a few years ago, where he basically recreated the Opet festival. And they brought these boats out with like images of the gods included on the boats. And it was all in old Egyptian or middle period Egyptian something. I couldn't understand a word of it, didn't really know what it was at the time. But for some reason, as I was reading about Nestason and how he's bringing out what he's doing with the Amun of Napata, I was thinking about this one part of that procession where this guy comes out, this singer, his name is Ezel Ostul, and he just starts singing this song, which I can't understand a word of. And it was just going through my head like this part of the procession and the song, even though I don't really understand the song. And I was like, why is that? Why am I thinking of this? So I went and found a translation of all the songs that are sung in that procession, a video with subtitles. And the one part that was coming up in my brain that was sung by this guy, Ezel Ostul, is actually a hymn to Amun. And he's talking about how Amun, you know, is like the Lord of the two lands, and he's happy for what we've done for him and all this kind of stuff. And so I was like, man, somewhere in the lower level of my brain, I figured it out. So this is kind of like what happened. This is kind of a similar experience, if you get what I'm saying. Now, of course, that's not proof, but what I want to do now is go through some of the mythology, and you can be the judge and tell me how much overlap you see, because we talked about, you know, the modern understanding of Neanderthals. Now I want to talk about the historic understanding or the mythology. So, okay, so let's get to it. So my theory is that the dwarves are our memory of the Neanderthals when they were interacting with our ancestors. So according to Britannica, let's see, the oldest term for dwarf was dvergir, Dvergr. It's an Old Norse, and what it means is it says dvergir denoted a species of fairy inhabiting the interiors of mountains and the lower levels of mines. Okay, and there's also some kind of blurring of the distinction between dwarves and dark elves. Of course, the word for dark elves was Dokafar. And some people think that the dwarves and dark elves are the same, like this guy that we just read, Neil Gaiman. But you know, some of the later understandings of the mythology, they separate dwarves from dark elves, but really they both come from the same world of Yggdrasil, the same world of the world tree, which is called Svartalfheim. And the part of it that the dwarves lived in is an underground zone called Nidavellir. And, you know, it's not clear if dwarves and dark elves are the same people or they're two different peoples, but the older texts, they say they're described as being both black as night and pitch black, and also very pale and light. How can somebody be very pale and very dark? If you have pale skin but you work at a forge or in a mine, then you get covered up with all kinds of soot, right? So let's look at some dwarf legends. Well, actually, I want to read a little bit more of Britannica first. Bearing in mind Neanderthals mostly lived in caves, right? Sometimes they had surface dwellings, but mostly in caves. So here's what Britannica says. The mountain dwarves were organized in kingdoms or tribes with their own kings, chieftains, and armies. They lived in subterranean halls believed to be full of gold and precious stones. They were principally famous for their skill in all kinds of metalwork and the forging of magical swords and rings, but they were also credited with profound wisdom and secret knowledge, having power to foresee the future, assume other forms, and make themselves invisible. Um, Many legends show dwarves as kindly beings, generous to those who please them, but vengeful when offended. The Swiss dwarves, or earthmen, sometimes helped in agricultural work, found straying animals, and put out firewood or fruit for poor children to find. In Scandinavia and Germany also, they were friendly to men, but occasionally they stole corn, teased cattle, and abducted children and young girls. Services rendered to them were often often repaid by gifts of gold from their hoards, but those who stole their treasures either met with great misfortune thereafter or found the gold turned to dead leaves when they reached home. All right. Mine-dwelling dwarves were usually more capricious and spiteful than their mountain brothers. They could be heard moving from the lower levels and were sometimes seen by miners. The oldest legends of dwarves associate them with stone, with working stone and making things out of it, but also living in stone and living in caves, but sometimes living in stone that's just on the surface. There's actually a place called the Dwarf Stone, which is like a huge, it's like a stone block, and someone carved a little tomb inside of it and put a heavy stone to block it up. And there's a legend about some dwarf that used to live there. So now what I want to do is just run with this a bit and go over some stories about dwarfs. Some of them you've heard of, and some of them maybe you haven't. And from these stories, I want to see what we can extrapolate about their culture, what generalizations, their culture and behavior. So Stilgar, you know the story about Loki and Sif, right? Where
Loki and sorry, who?
Sif, Loki and Sif,
I
where
probably do, but I just can't think of it right now.
yeah, it's also in that book that you gave me. Okay, so I'll remind you. Basically,
Sif is the one with
Loki,
the golden hair.
yeah, Loki comes in when she's sleeping and shaves her head in the night,
Yeah, and
and
then his brother is not so happy with it.
right, yeah,
Hmm.
I probably wouldn't be happy either. Um, but not just that, he casts a spell so that her hair won't grow back, so it's like a permanent act of spite.
Yeah.
And so Loki is tasked with making it right. So he goes to the dwarves for help. He goes to the sons of Ivaldi first, these two dwarves, and he asks them to make some hair for Sif. And they pound out some gold as fine as a woman's hair, and it's going to become her new replacement hair, which they'll attach to her scalp. But they make some other stuff too, like they make a spear for Odin, and then a boat called Skidbladnir, which is collapsible. It can be like reduced in size so that you can carry it in your pocket or whatever. And he could have just taken these gifts and straight given them to the gods and maybe won back some of his favor, but instead he goes to the other dwarves, Brock and Eitri, and says, I bet that you guys can't make something better than these gifts. And they say, sure, we can, but they don't really want to. So Loki tells them, like, hey, if you make some devices, some treasures that are better than these treasures, I'll let you guys take my head. And so they make some gifts, and one of them is the hammer that Thor is going to use. And when all these things are presented to the gods, they actually decide that Brock and Eitri's work is better. And so the dwarfs want to cut off Loki's head because that's what they were promised. But Loki, he says, oh, I said you could take my head, but I didn't say you could take my neck. So if you can find a way to take my head without taking my neck, then it's yours. Otherwise, it stays with me. And then so what they do is they pin him down and they sew his lips shut, because that's their attempt to take his head without cutting his neck, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So they held him to his word, but he played a verbal trick on them. And so also there's the story of Snow White, which was written later, and that story we've talked about separately was an ancient Dark Ages tradition, which was written down much, much later by the Grimm's brothers. And in the story of Snow White, what are the dwarves doing? There's 7 dwarves.
Are they mining?
They're mining. Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
So, and then when Snow White dies or appears to die, they put her in a glass coffin, or a coffin made of some crystalline material that has gold letters etched into the side. So I want to read a little quote from the original Snow White story here. And this is regarding when the prince finds Snow White and how he deals with dwarves. So he saw the coffin on the mountain and the beautiful Snow White within it, and read what was written upon it in golden letters. Then he said to the dwarves, "Let me have the coffin. I will give you whatever you want for it." But the dwarves answered, "We will not part with it for all the gold in the world." Then he said, "Let me have it as a gift, for I cannot live without seeing Snow White. I will honor and prize her as my dearest possession." As he spoke in this way, the good dwarves took pity on him and gave him the coffin. So they didn't care about, they weren't going to let him buy it, but when they saw that he was really being sincere, then they decided to just let him have it. I thought that was kind of interesting, how he went from offering everything to just straight saying, "Let me have it as a gift then, if you don't want to sell it." And it worked. That strategy worked. And there's another dwarf. I'm going to keep moving. Another dwarf called Andvari. Have you heard of Andvari before?
I don't think so.
I hadn't heard of him either. But this dwarf also comes from the Old Norse mythology, and his name means careful one. And he lives underneath a waterfall and was a highly skilled craftsman. He also has some magical abilities, one of which allows him to transform into a pike, which is a type of fish, and then swim around in the river that's out in front of his cave. So he can, I guess, guard his treasure or enter and leave the cave clandestinely. And he creates a magic ring called Andvaranot, which he uses to acquire more gold for his hoard. And eventually what happens is Loki comes and steals all of his gold and takes his ring. But before he gets away, Andvari runs away for his life. But he manages to curse the gold and the ring so that it will bring misfortune to whoever has it. And there's another dwarf named Alvis, and this dwarf nearly marries the daughter of Thor, whose name is Thrud. And Alvis was known throughout the 9 realms as being a master craftsman, and also for being highly intelligent. He's got a high IQ and a good deal of knowledge. So Thor, he wants to stop the marriage because he doesn't think this guy is good enough for his daughter. And Thor meets with Alvis in night. So it's not underground. He's out on the surface where he meets with him, but it's during the night. And he asks him a lot of questions about different things. And Alvis is answering all the questions, and he gets so engaged and focused on that he forgets what time it is. And while he's there discussing, the sun comes up, and Alvis is actually turned to stone by it. Now, from what I've seen, this is the only incident of a dwarf turning to stone from the sunlight, but it is a recurring theme in the older lore that dwarves don't like the sun and that they're sensitive to it. And that's one of the reasons given for why they might be living underground, basically. So again, like we talked about earlier, Neanderthals, they burn. So here we can see some of that. It's a good, man. Well, let's keep going. There's another incident. This is involving some more dwarves. These guys, their names are Alfred, Dwalen, Berlig, and Grer. And sorry, Berling. And what they're doing is they're making very nice jewelry with gold and jewels, very elaborate, high quality stuff, well designed stuff. And Freya comes across them while they're at their work and sees what they're doing, and she wants the jewelry, and she asks them, if she can buy it, but the price that they want her to pay for the jewelry is that she's got to sleep with each of them. So it just at least once or just once. So she sleeps with all of these guys, and then she gets the necklace. That's what she has to do to pay for it. And the necklace she gets from this encounter is called the Breisingamen. Breisingamen. Okay. So here we see that, again, master craftsmen.
And early OnlyFans adopters.
Yeah. Pretty much, yeah. The Dark Ages OnlyFans.
Yeah.
Give me jewelry for my presents.
For my breast, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's one more example that I want to talk about another dwarf. And this guy's name is Alberic. And Alberic appears, in the Christian era, post, during the medieval period. He appears in some stories, different stories that, like medieval epics that have nothing to do with each other. So he's, to my knowledge, there's probably more than this. He actually comes from an older tradition, but he appears in the Nibelungenlied and Ortnit. And again, like both of these kind of draw from older traditions. In the Nibelungenlied, he's described as a bold and savage dwarf. And here's a quote. He says, "Now Alberic was bold and stout, and on his body he had a helmet and coat of mail, and his hand a heavy scourge of gold. He hasted and fell on Siegfried. The scourge had 7 heavy knobs hanging from it, whereat he smote so heavily to the left upon the shield that he well nigh brake it." And he's living inside of a mountain too, by the way. Now, I haven't read the whole story of Nibelungenlied. I read some of it. But if anybody's interested, I did find a place where you could download it free as a PDF. So the link will be below. Now, the other story that I mentioned is called Ortnit. And Ortnit was written in the 1200s AD. Now, Ortnit doesn't have anything to do with the Nibelungenlied, but the same mythological character of Alberic appears in this story as well. So Alberic is the father of Ortnit, who's the main character. And Ortnit's mother was a Lombard queen who was married to some guy that was sterile and could not impregnate her. So Alberic came in order to cause her to bear a child. He did the duty, basically. And later on, Ortnit, when he grows up, he wants to marry a Saracen woman who's in the Middle East in the Islamic realms. And the problem is that this woman's father kills everybody that tries to come for her or something like that. And Ortnit needs some help to get his hands on her. So he's actually assisted by Alberic, who tells him that he's his father, and he displays great physical strength in the story. And one of the things that happens in the story is while they're on the quest, Alberic goes to the Saracen woman, and she says, "I will only go with you, or I'll only give you a chance, or whatever, if you can prove that you're stronger than my gods." And she worships Muhammad and I think it was Apollo, something crazy like that. But at any rate, Alberic, what he does is he smashes up her shrine and throws it off into the moat. So I'm guessing it's like a stone shrine, and this guy is just smashing it up. And Alberic also gives Ortnit a magic stone that allows him to speak and understand any language. Yeah, the princess, she wants him to prove that he's stronger than her gods. So, yeah, what are some of the recurring themes that we can see, Stilgar?
They're strong.
Yeah. There's
They great tools.
mhm. They're strong. They live underground. They're master craftsmen. They make tools as well as it looks like jewelry and magical objects, which could also be understood as machines potentially. Um, and this culture, does it seem like they seem to have a bit of a sex drive, right? Would you say?
Yeah, I mean, in these stories, sure.
Yeah, they have a bit of a sex drive. Um, they're not considered to be the most physically attractive, but they still find ways. And would you say that it looks like they're bound by their word? Like they tend to keep their word, right?
Yeah, yeah. So that's how you connect the autism there.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's an interesting hypothesis. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can't prove it 100%, but it's one of those things that if the shoe fits, wear it. Like we have a foot, which is the Neanderthal, and we have a shoe which fits it, which is the dwarf. And you would think that if, our ancestors came and they interacted with these people, they would have some memory of it, right? Um, and they'd pass it down. Maybe they don't call it what we call it because the name Neanderthal wasn't invented till the 1800s. But these people would have been called something, before they died out. So, you see some similarities like them living underground, being associated with stone, engaged in craftsmanship, having a strong sex drive. Like I said, Neanderthals had high levels of testosterone. They generally lived underground. Um,
Did they live underground though?
Neanderthals,
Yeah.
the dwarves.
I mean,
Dwarves live,
Neanderthals.
yeah, Neanderthals, they usually lived in caves. Not always, but most of the time.
Well, that's where we found their bones, right?
I don't know if bones were always found in caves.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
Fair enough. I mean, they found like drawings and tools and stuff.
they find drawings and tools in caves. And I think in some caves they also found bones. My guess is that the
But
bones.
maybe that's just because they survived there. That's the only place they would survive instead of out in the open.
Yeah,
But
so we're
I mean,
we're
yeah,
talking about like the first people that came into Europe. So
yeah.
so so here's my theory. The Ivor Kovac theory. If anybody wants to name it after me, that's fine, but it's not necessary that they do. But here's my theory. Basically, the Neanderthals got to Europe first before our ancestors did, and there was nobody there, but there's big animals that are still there, like woolly mammoths. And because these guys, they were really buff and swole, which is why they needed to eat so much. And so they generally subsisted off of the animals. But the animals started to go extinct, maybe as a result of climate change. It looks like there was some serious climate change in the past because it's a fact that the ocean levels rose up and they submerged like a lot of settlements and cities. So it could be related to that or before that. I'm not really sure. But basically, they got there first. There was nothing. And then our ancestors came a bit later and were more numerous. Now, the Neanderthals had a much higher food requirement than we do. And it looks like they didn't really engage with farming. And that's another thing. Have you ever heard of dwarves farming?
Never.
Never. Right. Um,
An
so
elf,
what I'm,
maybe, not a dwarf.
yeah.
Yeah.
So what I'm thinking is that as the food became scarce, there was probably some conflict between them and us. But as the food
Well, and
became,
also the climate, the climate change.
yeah,
It was getting cold, right? And it was the ice age. Isn't that when a lot of them died out? Like if you have to hunt for food and there's like fewer animals available because of all the cold, because the animals need to eat plants as well. And then there's humans hunting for the same sources of food as well.
So yeah, so what I'm thinking is maybe the Ice Age was also part of it, but whether it's because of the Ice Age or just because of over hunting, the big food animals become scarce and eventually go extinct. Like there are no more mammoths anymore. So, but these guys still need to eat. They still need that much food. So what I think happens is some of them just died off completely. Some of them might have been exterminated, but I think that a lot of them just moved in with our ancestors because probably what happened is like, hey, I can do all this stuff. I'm way stronger than you guys. I can do the mining and the crafting, the stuff that I like to do. I'll do this for you if you if you provide me with food, because we did a lot more farming than they did. So I think that, and this is how we got the admixture, that a lot of them just moved in with our ancestors and took up specialized tasks like mining and blacksmithing. And then they married with European women. And as the generations went on, the kids just looked, they might have persisted in the same trade because that is something that's, fairly common in European cultures, is that the trades are hereditary, passed down from father to son. So I think that over time they ended up just becoming indistinguishable from the standard Europeans, and their DNA just became like ubiquitous at like 3%. And gradually it was just a matter of myths and lore. So genes is we have genes from them, but then there's also ideas that get passed down, right? Even in illiterate cultures, you have ideas that get passed down and preserved over time. They get distorted too, but they also get preserved. And even if you forget the original meaning, there was an original meaning. So you can think of the Dwarven lore as the meme side of it, like what we remember of these people as they came in. So yeah, that's my theory, is that they basically became the blacksmiths and everything, and some of them probably just hung out in the woods. Now I don't say that like all these stories that I read here are true. I think they're not, but they're based on, at some point when they were composed, they were based on knowledge that was already there in the culture, right? So
Yeah,
probably
and
that's
I think you should call this episode "Were the Neanderthals in fact dwarves?" I think that's
well,
a good show. Yeah.
yeah, maybe I could call that one, or I could just make it ambiguous and call it a possible
Or
historical identity for dwarves, and that way everyone's forced to watch it, or either
yeah.
that, or they'll just skip to the end. Um,
Or actually, it should be "Were dwarves Neanderthals?" But yeah, something like that.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of overlap. There's too much overlap to ignore, and the fact that we have this idea, we have these people in our lore that fit the bill, and the idea was passed down. So, I mean, they physically, that's what they look like. They look like dwarves, and
Yeah,
and
I do have to say though, I'm looking up some pictures, and I'm sure you'll put pictures of Neanderthals in the show
hmm,
or in the episodes. But it does bother me because I feel like a lot of those, they use like clay, and it looks a bit like these wax museums, like and then you get this impression like they were all like with these really weird kind of skin looking skin, with like major wrinkles. And I don't think the Neanderthals looked as ugly as they depict them in what you can find on the internet. So
yeah, I've got, believe me, I've got a huge library of images because I've actually been reading. I've been reading and articles and harvesting images for months actually for this, but it just took me this long to get around to it. So
and I
yeah,
just
there's
noticed that Microsoft Copilot is extremely racist against Neanderthals. Because I ask it to create a picture based on the latest science, and then it lists the latest science, which is basically what you just talked about. And then it's like, okay, use this data and create a picture, and wearing modern human clothes, and what it creates is, and go test it out, like for yourself. It creates this total chimpanzee looking image of a Neanderthal. So
I have a bunch of somebody generated like a bunch of images of Neanderthals which look pretty good based on the latest data on them, but then they decided to show Neanderthals doing stuff like taking pictures with cell phones inside their caves, sitting around in front of tablets. So I might put that in the slideshow as well. But yeah, I mean, it does seem like
there's a lot of junk out there, like Neanderthals with like extremely weird looking teeth, or just like the wax skin, like it's about to melt off their face any second.
yeah, that's because it is. They're waxwork figures
Yeah,
now.
I know they're waxwork figures, but anyway, you'd think they'd have something better nowadays, where you can just there's a lot of junk. Anyway,
Yeah,
yeah.
there's yeah, you're right. Some of the stuff is pretty garbage. But yeah, actually I did find a lot of good artwork and I'll include that. Before we go, I want to just touch on two more things, two other theories, because of course, like as I've said many times, I'm a Christian. I don't believe in the official narratives with evolution and millions of years. Um, but there are some other guys that have other theories on the Neanderthals apart from the mainstream theory. So, and even different than mine. So I want to touch on these. So I read a book called Buried Alive by a guy named Jack Quazzo. And Jack Quazzo is an orthodontist who went and studied the actual Neanderthal bones that are usually not where people can see them. They're kept in drawers and in back rooms and stuff like that. And what he said is something like 90% of the Neanderthal skeletons and bones that you see in the museums on display are actually duplicates. And they usually don't let the real ones see the light of day. But this guy studied the real ones. And as an orthodontist, he's very familiar with the way that teeth grow and the way that the face grows, like the jaw and the nose and the forehead and all that stuff. And he studied bones from adult Neanderthals and children and I think one adolescent. And what he came to the conclusion is that they were very old. Like the adults with the huge brow ridges lived for over 200 years. And the way he arrived at his figures was he started with like the teenage specimen of a Neanderthal and then compared him to some adult specimens, and then he used modern the bone growth rate of modern humans and calculated based on the fastest possible growth rate how long it would take from get to this teenager to get to this adult. And he was getting figures like 200 years, 300 years, and also the amount of I forget what that formation or folds or something in the teeth. I forget what exactly it was. So I'm just going to read a quote from his book. And this, at the very least, should give you an idea of how trustworthy the establishment is. So one other incident I must mention concerns the Laquina 5 skull on the cover of this book. One of the remaining paleontologists who didn't go on vacation in August was working on the famous Laquina adult female jaws, Laquina 5. He was placing all the teeth in the lower jaw and into positions in a plastic substance. He also was reshaping the chin. As the cover shows, the lower jaw had a pretty fair-sized chin on it when it was first discovered. This human paleoanthropologist brought the jaw over to me when he finished setting up the lower teeth and asked me how they looked. Not much I could say, but fine. Can I take a photo of that setup? Actually, the chin had started to disappear in the Neanderthal centenary photograph in 1956 in the two illustrations by L. plate 5, our cover, shows a chin in the original block of stone originally excavated in 1911 by H. Martin. So between 1911 and 1956, La Quina 5 lost part of its chin. The remaining amount disappeared in the summer of 1979 while I was in that museum. Whoever that person was, he had removed the rest of the chin and used a plastic-like material so that no real chin appeared anymore. This could truly be called evolution after death. So basically, this book was written in, let's see, when was it written here? He published this in 1998 and did his research earlier at an earlier time. So this guy sanded off the chin of the lower jaw of the Neanderthal in order to make it look more ape-like, basically. So one of the things in some of the articles I read, like news articles and things like that, they said if you have less of a chin, like a not prominent chin, then that could be a result of Neanderthal ancestry. But I have my doubts about whether or not that's really the case, because maybe they just sanded off the chins on all of them. Although it looks like the guy didn't have as big of a chin as like you or me, to begin with, the skeleton that they found. I can put a picture of that in the slideshow too. And also, so Jack Quazzo's conclusions is that the Neanderthals are just ancient man, like regular, that they are our ancestors, and that our ancestors just looked like this because they lived longer, and so their facial bones and everything grew to a greater size. Now, what causes me to have, I do think that his evidence is compelling, and it does look like, yeah, they probably did live longer, but I don't believe that these are the standard normal Europeans. I do believe that they're a separate race, and the thing about Jack Quazzo's research is he doesn't take into account the DNA, because he did all his research, or at least most of it, before they had analyzed the Neanderthal DNA. Of course, they sequenced the Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA in 1997, I think it was. 1997. And he released this book in 1998. And then the autosomal DNA wasn't even sequenced until later. So it looks like something is definitely being tracked genetically. But at the same time, I always have a grain of doubt when it comes to the official establishment views, which, the media likes to refer to ad nauseum as the science. Like, I'm sorry, but so that's his view. I just thought I would mention that because I did read his book, and he also mentioned about the Neanderthal arms being, very good for this craftsmanship as well. Like, it appears in their skeletons. And then there's another theory, and this is from another Christian scientist. I think this guy's a geneticist. Let me go down here. And what this guy says is, okay, so this guy, his name is Dr. Rob Carter, and his theory on the Neanderthals is that their unique physical appearance is due to them being mutated, like more mutated than usual. And why are they mutated? Well, what he said is that as men, we, unlike women, we never lose our ability to reproduce, right? Typically. But the older we are, the more mutations creep into our sperm. So when you reproduce at an older age, there's a greater chance of having problems, giving your kids some kind of problem, like passing on these mutations, because the quality of your sperm is not as good. And of course, people used to live much longer after the flood, and then their lifespans dropped off precipitously until we get to the lifespans that we have today. So what Dr. Rob Carter thinks is that the Neanderthals and the other kind of unusual races of man that used to exist were a result of these very, very old men reproducing later in life, like when they're 400 years old, 500 years old, and they've accumulated more mutations. Now, I don't know if that's true, but, you know, like getting back to the thing about autism and not being able to endure the sun, that kind of thing could just be mutations. You know, something is not properly formed genetically, if you get what I'm saying. And I kind of, you know, I like to read what everybody says, whether it's, you know, people that agree with me and people that don't agree with me, and then at the end of it all, form my own views, right? So what I think is it's a little bit, you know, probably all these things could be true, and these guys did live longer, and their bizarre physical appearance could be the result of both, you know, living longer and having a little bit garbled up DNA. So, yeah, I think that covers everything. There is some more stuff that I wanted to touch on, but I think it's this is long enough already. My son, in case you're interested, we could do like another video on some of the weird stuff, because I found some other stuff that was pretty weird. But there's my son, my oldest son, when I was talking about this with him, like saying, yeah, I think that the dwarves are actually Neanderthals, or the Neanderthals are where our dwarf ideas come from. And so he said, oh, so when Tolkien wrote about, he wrote his stories, his dwarves are really just Neanderthals. And at first I said, no, of course not. But then I got to be thinking, maybe somewhat to some degree, because, you know, Tolkien, he read all kinds of mythology and all kinds of history and studied languages. And like I said, man, when you acquire all this kind of knowledge, you get the ability to make predictions. Predictions not just about the future, but about the past. And it changes the way that your brain works and the way that you think about things, and even the way that you talk, because you know, you won't say as much of always or never, or think of something is always going to be a certain way, you know, because you know better. So we can talk about that maybe in a bonus content about like how Tolkien might relate. What do you think? Is it worthwhile?
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe. Yeah.
Dive deeper into.
Yeah, maybe we can deal with that as like a bonus thing, a bonus entry, not like a regular video, because I think that's probably enough of this. But yeah, you know, and it seems like the memory of these people did get passed down, because like I just ask you, what is a dwarf and how do they look, and you've already got it in your mind, right?
Mm.
So that has to come from somewhere, and it looks like we found the original source of that. So, alrighty then, I think that's good enough. Do you have anything else?
No, just a comment on the science that a lot of scientists nowadays, similar to a lot of historians, they don't actually do any research. They just read other people's stories or other people's research, and then they combine it and they create new. Well, it's kind of like what we're doing now as well, except we're trying to go into some other source materials. But that's when you get a certain bias, like for example on Darwinism, which has been part of like bias of Western education for a very long time, and then it like becomes part of it, and it creates certain stereotypes, and then like now you get new data that shows that like yeah, actually the Neanderthals weren't like these brutes that were like dumb and slouching over, hairy. Actually, they were highly intelligent, and they were just they could exist today, and you know, and probably function in our society just like we do, because they're just humans, and to paint them as like a dumb, stupid version of humans doesn't make any sense. I think that's just my cup of my 2 cents. And by the way, that this whole ideology about Darwinism and survival of the fittest, and we just one human race is going to survive. That is also at the root of so much misery. It's why millions of people have been killed. It's why the basis of a lot of racism in today. And yeah, it's just. But again, it's supposedly science, but in the end, it's just it's a bias, and then the bias turns into a secular form of religion.
Yeah, it's
With
actually, I wouldn't
very dire
even,
consequences. Yeah.
right. Well, of course, what you believe about origins, um, it does have bearing on your philosophy and how you approach the world. I don't, I don't consider evolution to be science because it's not arrived at via the scientific method. Scientific method requires observation and repeatability, and what they do in evolution is they make all kinds of assertions, and they do it from a position of authority. And I don't really respect authority. I
And they
respect.
and they also did it based on observations they did hundreds of years ago that were incomplete. And now, if you, for example, but that's a whole nother subject. If you look at the most basic form of life, like the cell,
Mhm.
if you dive deeper into it, and of course Darwin had no possibility to do it, but if you go and you look at, like, okay, like, how does it work, how is it put together, if you look at it nowadays, this whole idea of that, oh, we just had some inorganic matter, and then over time, lightning would hit the same soup of organic or inorganic matter, and then it would somehow get together and form a functioning cell. Uh, yeah,
It's a tall order,
it's
which
a tall
also.
order, and then, like, they're always like, "Oh, we're gonna do it," and they've been saying it for decades, and actually, they're just discovering that the more they look into it, the more they realize, oh, it's actually way more complicated and way more complex than we initially thought, because nowadays we have a much deeper understanding of how the world actually works.
Yeah.
So that's how you create, like, a secular religion, is because you don't have all the facts. You start just making certain suppositions, and then, anyway, before you know it, you have this theory that becomes a religion. Well, I think that should be another topic, maybe. But I thought it was good to hear more about that you straightened out some facts on the Neanderthals, who they were. I thought it was an interesting idea that maybe in our folklore that the dwarves were somehow related to the Neanderthals. Why not? As
Well, what
tool
I
makers.
think
Yeah.
what I think is that the dwarves are a cultural memory of
Yeah.
Neanderthals from a
Yeah.
time when we shared land with them. And
Mm.
and you see, like, and there's another story like about Rumpelstiltskin. Did you read that one?
Yeah.
Where Rumpelstiltskin he might be something else. He might be an imp, but I think he's also supposed to be a dwarf. He also he uses he spins gold from like a loom or something like that. And he, I forget all the details of the story, but basically he gets into a verbal contract, and the only way she can be released from it is if she finds out what his name is or something. And then there's different versions of the story, like how it ends, because it was originally an oral tradition. And this guy, when he finds out that he loses the deal, then he goes into such a rage, and in one version, he actually grabs himself by the leg and rips himself in two. And in another version, he stomps on the ground so hard that a fault line forms and he falls into the cracks or something like that. So there's great strength relative to the size, and a smaller size, skilled craftsmanship. Um, and it's just, there's too much to just be a coincidence. Um, And again, like if our ancestors interacted with these people, they would remember that, even if it's just some oral traditions. And if we existed side by side with them, which we must have, because 2 or 3 of our percent of our DNA comes from them. Um, and then there's a few things, like why is
Rumpelstiltskin was an imp, though.
okay? Yeah, I was all right. So maybe that one doesn't count.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you can see like some things like they're really big into keeping their word, and even when they're malevolent, they still get bound by that kind of thing. Um, so you can kind of see it, and I'm
But
thinking,
you do see that part. You see that a bit with demons and witches as well,
yeah,
right?
but they're not
Yeah.
demons and witches aren't excellent craftsmen that always
No.
live under the ground and are sensitive to sun and have a high sex drive and eat lots of meat. I think their food intake and their autism are the things that so their physical strength, yeah, they could crush you in a fight, but they have to eat a lot more food. So one way is their design is actually not as efficient as ours. Like we can survive off of less than they can. We don't have
Yeah.
the same requirement.
Well,
Uh,
I mean, that's when like starvation hits, then the tall people are the first ones to go, typically.
yeah, because they need to eat more.
They need to
So
eat more. So, but if they had a much higher metabolism, dogs have a much higher metabolism as well. One of the reasons we still have crocodiles, um, and not dinosaurs, is because crocodiles have a very slow metabolism. Same for turtles. So that when disaster hits, like a natural calamity, and there's no food around, they can just hibernate for a very long time and just like every now and then eat a cadaver or something. Whereas us humans or like mammals, unless we're small, um, and we don't need to eat much, but yeah, we're having a very hard time. So yeah,
yeah, so I think
yeah,
that did them in, and also the autism as well. I think autism adversely affects your ability to form communities, and actually there was a movie that was made. Uh, there's a movie that was made called William, where these scientists, it's a fiction story, but these scientists, they cloned a Neanderthal and raised him as a baby.
yeah,
And the way that they portrayed this character in the movie is they basically made him as a autist, where he got annoyed with he couldn't read like nonverbal stuff very well, and um, he hated symbolism and things that were not straightforward. So like English class, he hated it because they made him interpret everything, and he's like, why can't it just be what it says? Why does it have to be something else? And then who decides these things anyways, And there was a scene in the movie where he actually participated in like a school musical, and for part of the musical he had to kiss this girl, and it's a show, but he thought, oh, she's really into me, and then he tried to kiss her again afterwards. She was like, eh. So it's I think if an of course it's a fictitious movie, but I think if you were to bring a Neanderthal to the modern world, first of all, we still have people that look like Neanderthals,
I think if you
which
would bring a Neanderthal to the modern world, based on your characteristics, with the level of autism, they would design like social media, like Facebook and 4chan and
yeah,
Etsy, and then design all those because they're like visually strong, and they take everything, literally, and they're not as non-verbal, so they would be better with text. They'd probably be good programmers, stuff
yeah,
like that. Yeah,
programmers and engineers, or maybe those of them that aren't just mechanics, stuff like that with their physical strength and uh, dexterity would be a huge advantage. Things that would be that they could just focus on, like laser focus on, while also not having.
Weightlifters.
Man, that would not even be fair. Like their upper limit would, yeah. But then
That's
they'd
why I
be.
said Bulgarians, by the way, because they have some really great weightlifters. But yeah, yeah.
There's a story that I came across in my research, and it's anecdotal, of course, and I haven't been able to corroborate it with anything else. But there is this guy whose grandfather lived like in the last century, I think, towards the beginning of it, and he came across a village of people that he thought were Neanderthals, or mostly Neanderthal. And the way he described them is
Yeah.
that the there was like a hidden mountain village kind of thing that no roads went to, and all these people were like really wide frames with big chests and hairy. And this guy that he was staying with, he invited him over to his house and said, "You might like to meet my daughter." And he comes to the house, and the daughter is also hairy. And he was horrified by that. So at night, he climbed out of the window and ran away and never went back because he was afraid that they might force him to marry this woman. And I was thinking, is it true? Because there's like the the studies that I've seen, what they've and this could change, because discoveries are ongoing. But the studies I've seen and the conclusion that some of these people make is that the Neanderthal women did not pass on their DNA into the European gene pool. The DNA that we have from Neanderthals comes from male sources because we don't have any of their mitochondrial DNA. So if the women were really hairy and had beards or something, then it would be something that the Neanderthal man is going to go with the European women over one of his own women because it's considered masculine for what makes a man
Except for that
attractive.
one guy, it's gonna be like, yeah, baby.
Yeah, you'd
I
have
want,
like
I want
some.
me some hairy ladies, like keep me nice and warm and cozy at night.
Yeah, I don't know if they really were hairy or if that
Yeah,
story is at all true, but
yeah.
you
But
know
maybe so if they had very high levels of testosterone on both the male and the female side,
they
then
would have, because
yeah,
if the testosterone is, I mean, women, they have lower
because
testosterone anyway.
because I think if you give testosterone to women, like steroids and stuff, like those like those Soviet like Olympic weightlifters and stuff, on the women's side, they would give them like steroids, and they
Right.
would start to grow like 5 o'clock shade or a little mustache even. So,
Yeah, I've seen how women look when they take steroids. They do end up looking like men, and so
but you
sometimes
know
they do
what?
get.
But if I were like a modern human living in like this 40,000 years ago, and I got myself like a strong lady, intelligent lady, and she's a little hairy, I'd be totally fine with that. Just saying. Yeah, is there's gonna be like a wolf around the corner?
What if she's
Like,
got like a hairy face though?
I don't care, man. There's a wolf that wants to eat you. Yeah. You don't have light. It's gonna be dark most of the time. You live in a cave. Like, what do you care? I wouldn't care.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
actually
would you
would
rather get
care.
eaten by the wolf or the bear? Like, seriously. It's like, I'd be like, all right, lady, woman, I need your help.
Yeah, I don't know if they were. I don't know if they were hairy or not, but it's
Yeah,
possible. It definitely, it's
yeah.
definitely possible. And then, people trade up when they look for a spouse. Women much more so than men, and like if a lot of times when you have different races that come together, sometimes women will be like, no, I prefer that one over this one, and they'll jump ship. Um, and it creates more competition for mating partners actually, and some people get left out, there's actually patterns to, of course, it's not politically correct to discuss this, but there have been some studies, and there's patterns to how people select across races. And, for some races, like women are more desired, and for others, men are more desired. So it could have been a situation where the men were more desired, because if they all have masculine qualities, including the women, well then, like if the race as a whole has more masculine qualities, that helps the men, but it hurts the women as soon as competition is introduced and there's more feminine women. But yeah, I
That's
mean, I
why
thought about
I'd
that
be
too.
going after the women. You'd be able to get the best Neanderthal woman as a,
Yeah,
you know,
I
because
figured you would find their women attractive. Um,
I know I'd be like, I'm sorry you got autism, but like show me some of the tools you're making. And
I think you'd be
anyway,
fine with that, because then then you would have a woman who typically does not engage in non-relevant conversations.
yeah,
So a lot less time would be wasted on foolishness. And she might also be more direct with you in her communication and not use as much innuendo and reverse psychology. I hate reverse psychology, man. It
but
just
I agree, and 100%. And one thing I wanted to add to the conversation before we should probably close it off
Hmm?
is I know, like, I've always been fascinated about bringing back mammoths. Like they would find like these frozen mammoths in Siberia, and there's actually a company working on bringing like coding the DNA of a mammoth, and they're hoping to create an embryo and put it into an Asian elephant,
hmm.
and then I think that would be really really exciting. Um, I wonder if that's possible, or if that's possible with Neanderthals. Because if it is, I think that would be really really cool, and they should try it.
Yeah, that's what that movie William was about. And I would have no problem with trying that. I think that would be great. But my understanding, based on what I've seen so far, is that they've never sequenced the entire DNA of a single individual. Like the DNA is corrupt. So when they say that we've sequenced the Neanderthal genome, they sequence like say 50% from one individual, 60% from another,
Yeah,
80% from another, but there's different alleles that are sequenced with each individual, so they've managed to create a generalized sketch of the whole sequence, but they don't have an actual genome of an intact individual. So the way that cloning works with our level of technology is, when you clone an organism, you clone the DNA of that organism at the time that you harvested the DNA. So if it's something that's already aged and old, or it's already begun to age, then it will reach adulthood and basically age rapidly to the point. I think that was there was like some scientists in England, they did that with a sheep. I think it was called Dolly. And the sheep reached adulthood and then didn't live that long because the DNA was already worn down. Like as you get older, your telomeres wear off.
yeah.
And if you're going to clone a Neanderthal, you need to clone a
You have
young
to be a
specimen,
baby or something. Yeah.
like a baby or a kid, and you need to find an intact genome. If they can do that, I'd support that. I think I could hang out with these people if they were still around.
Same.
Uh, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and it
All
would
right,
be
man.
interesting. Yep. All right, so I think that's good. I think maybe we overdid this one. I don't know, but yeah, let's go ahead and close it off then.
Okay.
Alrighty. So if you made it to the end this far, thank you for listening and congratulations. And we will read any comments in the comments section below. Do leave us some feedback. And yeah, other than that, I guess see you guys in the next one.